Leonard Sloan, financial columnist with the New York Times. Front page of the New York Times today says this: debate on budget begun in Senate. Voting is put off. Dole, after pressing for tally, unexpectedly drops plan when outlook dims. Jonathan Feuerbringer wrote the story. Dateline, Washington. The Senate began debate today on a federal budget that would reduce the deficit by $52 billion in '86, but the Republican leadership put off a symbolic vote on the plan endorsed by President Reagan in his television address Wednesday night. Do you think individuals around the country really pay attention to the politics of what's going on in Washington over the budget?
I think they pay attention, all right. Indirectly, it affects their own personal financial lives. However, I think it's hard for individuals to grasp the concept of billions of dollars and what it means to them. I think we all know that it's bad, that these large deficits are really bad for the economy. And what happens is that by having such a large deficit, it means that the government is borrowing more, of course, and if the government is borrowing more, it means that there's less funds available for we as individuals to borrow as well as for corporations to borrow. What this means then is that interest rates are going to rise. The larger the deficits, the odds are that the interest rates will be higher. And that affects all of us who buy a house, who buy a car, who do any kind of consumer borrowing. So yes, it does affect us all.
Inside of the Washington Post, we have this story. Helen Dewar wrote it. The headline says, GOP senators dealt a setback, delayed budget debate opens. And in the very middle of the story, as I read, the fight is over a compromise budget negotiated by the White House and Senate Republican leaders to reduce deficits by nearly $300 billion over the next 3 years, largely by making deep new cuts in domestic spending. It would eliminate or phase out nearly 20 programs, ranging from Amtrak subsidies to small business loans. It would make deep cuts in several dozen other programs, such as Medicare, student loans, and farm supports. It would freeze spending for most of the rest, including that of the politically sensitive Social Security retirement system. It also would trim Reagan's defense budget, although military spending would be allowed to rise 3% above inflation. No tax increases are proposed. Is this the most direct impact a budget like this has on people? That if they ride the Amtrak train every day to work and it's cut, then they're not going to have that ride? Or if they use Medicare, there's going to see cuts?
It means, yes, that they are going to have to spend more. If they ride those Amtrak trains, the fares may rise. And if they're on Medicare, they may have to pay more themselves. Or the government will spend as the government spends less. There are very many direct implications of these budget cuts. Perhaps many people are in favor of cutting the budget in theory, but when it comes down to how their own ox is being gored, that's where the problem arises. And that's why this is such a highly charged political matter, because when a congressman or a senator goes home and walks down his own Main Street and people start approaching him and say, gee, does this mean that I can't get a student loan for my kid? Or does this mean that I'm going to have to pay higher fares on Amtrak? Then the congressman and the senator feels it.
Our guest is Leonard Sloan, a financial columnist at the New York Times, author of this book, New York Times Book of Personal Finance. Just out. I assume this book is pretty recently on the newsstands?
Yes, it's brand new, and it's in the stores now.
The budget debate is what's hot around Washington right now. You heard the president give a nationally televised speech on Wednesday evening. And so we've invited Mr. Sloan to join us to talk about the implications of this budget, and since he's written this book on personal finance, the implications of the budget on you and your personal finances. Mr. Sloan has been with the New York Times since 1963, working as a financial correspondent, now a financial columnist. From 1958 to 63, he was business editor of Purchasing magazine. 56 to 58, he worked with the Wall Street Journal. He has a BA degree from Queens College in New York, has a master's degree in journalism from Columbia University. He is married, has 2 children, and was born and raised in New York City, New York. Phone lines are open for viewers in all areas of the country. We're going to be taking a look at headlines on the morning newspapers. We ask you as you have your breakfast or as you get ready for your workday and you're sitting in your office watching us perhaps, that you get out your newspaper, whatever the newspaper is that you read, and take a look at it and see if there's anything in your newspaper dealing with the budget process. Perhaps a story about what happened in the Senate yesterday dealing with the budget. Perhaps there's an editorial and your newspaper has taken a stand on the president's budget, or there's a column perchance dealing or commenting on the president's speech. That's what we're interested in. Go through your morning newspaper and join us, and if you can add to our discussion, we'd certainly like to hear from you. I'm going to hold up the op-ed page of the New York Times. Tom Wicker has a story, or has a column in today's New York Times in the Nation. It says, Reagan's real goal, and it kind of looks at the budget process and the president from a different standard. And it says the budget battle is a clash of philosophies. And the first paragraph of his op-ed piece says, the continuing battle of the budget is not only a struggle for deficit reduction, more importantly, it is a climactic clash of governing philosophies, a powerful effort by President Reagan to wipe out all but the most basic elements of New Deal and post-New Deal social programs. In the grand scheme of things, is that what we're seeing? Is that what the president wants to do, you think? Do away with the old New Deal?
I don't think he wants to do away with it completely, but the president basically believes in individual initiative, and he believes that the private sector can handle most of the problems of our economy, and that if we left it to the private sector, if we provided incentives for them, it's better than having the government do it all. And this is his basic philosophy, and he was elected by a large vote, so I think that he feels that he's got a lot of the American people behind him.
If we look inside of the New York Times today, there are several stories dealing with the deficit. This one here by Peter Kilborn, Reagan and the Deficit, plea for spending cuts seen as realization that budget gap can jeopardize the economy. If we move down in the story here a little bit, it comments on what Walter Mondale was saying during the election, and it says, living on borrowed time. A month earlier, when he accepted the Democratic presidential nomination, Mr. Mondale said of the deficits, quote, here is the truth about the future. We are living on borrowed money and borrowed time. These deficits hike interest rates, clobber exports, stunt investment, kill jobs, undermine growth, cheat our kids, and shrink our future. If they are asked, Mr. Reagan and other administration officials still say there is no direct link between interest rates and the deficits, but they do not volunteer in speeches anymore, and faith in the economy's contribution to deficit reduction has abated. Now, there was a time when former Secretary of Treasury Don Regan would constantly repeat that the deficits do not have an impact on high interest rates. With the president's speech yesterday talking about fears of what the deficit will do to us, are we seeing a change in the Reagan administration's philosophy, perhaps now accepting that these $200 billion annual deficits do affect high interest rates in the economy?
Well, you know, the election was over. The election was last year, and now it's a lot more realistic. The Republican administration is not running for re-election, and I think that we're getting a little bit more of the straight scoop. To my mind, to say that high deficits do not affect interest rates is really Alice in Wonderland. It's an obvious link between the two, and I think that we're getting that now, either directly or indirectly, from the administration.
The president did say in his nationally televised speech that under no certain terms would he accept a tax increase. In yesterday's program, we spoke with a financial writer for the Los Angeles Times. He was suggesting that some of the Democrats in the Senate are now looking at a tax increase because there's really no other way of doing it. What do you think? Do you think a tax income is or a tax increase is something we'll have to look at to reduce these deficits?
Oh, I think we'll look at it, but I think that the practical chances of it passing Congress are very slim. What's more likely is tax reform. Some elements of the Treasury's proposals, those highly publicized proposals of last November, I certainly don't think all of them will get through, but I think that some of the deficit-cutting elements may be passed, and that, I think, can really affect the economy.
Referring once again to Tom Wicker's op-ed piece in the New York Times, the very last two paragraphs say this: a minimum corporate income tax is another justifiable, even desirable possibility. So would be the closure of loopholes. Senator Ernest Hollings of South Carolina says that over 5 years, $256 billion could be raised in that way. Some talk in the Senate now of a minimum corporate income tax of perhaps, say, 10%. Do you think we'll see something like that?
I don't think the president is going to push for anything like that. As a matter of fact, the administration has given out signals that it doesn't think that corporate income taxes are wise to begin with. The idea being that corporations don't make money, individuals make money, and the taxation should be at the individual level. You know, Carl, one man's loophole is another man's tax shelter, and to decide what is really a loophole, it really would require the wisdom of Solomon. So I think that we're going to go more along the lines of hitting individual tax reform as the Treasury initially proposed.
In that speech the president made on Wednesday, he asked people around the country to write their congressmen and senators. Tony Auth has this to say in his editorial cartoon in the Philadelphia Inquirer. It shows the president reading his speech, and he said, "So flood your congressmen and senators with postcards, letters, mailgrams," and over here, very small letters, "before we defund the Postal Service." What do you think the response will be with the president asking people to write letters and call? You expect people around the country to follow his advice or do what he says and start doing that?
I think that there is a lot of letter writing to congressmen, and I'm not so sure that the letters may be exactly what the president wants them to say, but I think there's going to be a lot of letters sent to Congress. I think if you ask a senator or a representative, they'll tell you that on hot issues, and especially an issue like this, they do get a lot of mail. And particularly since the president made a plea for people to write letters, I think people will be writing letters.
You concentrate on personal finance. Do you think individuals follow the intricate details of a debate over the federal budget?
No. I really don't. I think they read the headlines. Perhaps they scan some of the news stories on these complex budget issues. They watch television, they listen to the radio, and they get the overall grasp of it. But if you were to ask the average man on the street about the intricacies of what is happening in this budget debate, I think you wouldn't get any sense whatsoever out of it.
Now you were born and raised in New York. You've written there for many years. Many of the correspondents that we have on this program in particular, they are from someplace else, but they work in Washington, they cover Capitol Hill, and they're constantly immersed in the politics of Washington. From New York City, a 4.5-hour drive from here, what do people in New York City think of the debate going on here? Is it sometimes very serious, or do you think it's a little silly almost in some of the things that you hear taking place in Congress?
I don't think it's silly from our perspective, but I don't think it's the most important thing on earth. You know, in Washington, politics seems to be everything, and in New York, we look at it more from a perspective of the overall economy. What is happening to business? How will this affect business? How will it affect trade? How will it affect the various services that are delivered around the country? And so we don't put such great emphasis on every single word that comes out of a senator's mouth or out of a congressman's mouth.
Front page of USA Today has a personal finance story. Inflation is what it talks about, and it says inflation beats 85 starting pay. And it says employers are holding the line on salaries for 1985 college graduates. The College Placement Council checked 163 colleges and universities and found for the second straight year salaries are averaging only 2% to 3% higher than 1984, below the expected 4% inflation rate. Best earnings prospects are petroleum engineers. And down here it says the worst prospects for a job, humanities majors are averaging 16,556, up less than 1%. Is inflation going to be a problem again, you think, in the near future?
I don't think to the extent it once was of double-digit inflation, but inflation is there. It's something we've got to be conscious of, and salaries are not rising, at least for middle and lower levels, as they once were. As the father of one of these graduating humanities students this spring, I know what it's like, and salaries are not being offered at such high levels to compensate for the inflationary increases.
Our guest is Leonard Sloan, financial columnist and the author of this book, Personal Finance. We're going to be connected to the Federal Reserve Board, and I hold this up because I ask you, it seems that no matter what Paul Volcker says, people in New York and New York financiers really jump and hang on every syllable. Why is that, Leonard Sloan?
Well, that's because the Federal Reserve Board, of which Paul Volcker is chairman, has such a tremendous influence on our money markets, on the bond market, on the stock market. And when the Fed numbers come out every week, right away you see its effect on Wall Street. So people watch every nuance of what he says. They read things into things that shouldn't be read into. If he were to use the term, we shall do this instead of we will do this, some analysts will say, aha, he's trying to tell us something. And there's a little too much of that, but the Fed watchers are an industry unto themselves today.
Our viewers see on a regular basis, they see Paul Volcker testifying before one committee or another. He does seem to testify in a very cautious manner. Do you think that's why he is so cautious in what he says?
I think he has to be cautious because if he were to expand, just in the course of expanding, he may say something that perhaps he doesn't mean or doesn't want the implications to be taken in such a way. So he's got to be very precise, almost like a witness at a trial, you know, say yes, no, and I don't know.
We're taking a look at morning newspapers and what they have to say about the budget battle going on in Congress. First call for this hour is from Memphis, Tennessee. Do you have the Memphis Commercial Appeal with you this morning?
Right, Carol. How are you doing this morning?
I'm doing fine. How are things in Memphis?
Fine and dandy. Lovely day. Come on
Good.
down. We'll enjoy you.
I'd like to. I've always wanted to see the Mississippi.
Bring
one.
Leonard with you.
Okay.
Thank you.
What's on the front page?
Commercial Appeal could use it.
Is there anything in your newspaper that deals with the budget battle?
Yeah, but it's not on the front page, Carol. It's back on right next to the funnies. It's on the funny page. Now, I don't know if that's where it belongs, but that's where it is.
There's a budget story on the funny page. What's the headline and what does it say?
Budget battle gets slow start. And then there's a sub-article, Budget Pitch Sparks Calls. And it just talks about why they didn't get to a vote yesterday. And how Dole and Byrd were kind of toying with each other. And that they were going to have difficulty getting to that vote either today, maybe even until next week. The other article, which is even more important, is the response to the budget pitch that the president made, sparking the telephone calls that came in, which were about 20% of what they were in 1981, and they were far more evenly divided, pro and con. And some of the calls that they received said, well, we're for the president, but this is where we don't want to cut. You know, the same thing that Leonard was saying. If your ox is being gored, don't gore mine. You know, that type of thing. I have one criticism, Carl, from yesterday's program, if I may.
Sure, go ahead.
That was when the calls started coming in about the president's speech. And so many of them, it was very obvious. It was from all over the country, but they were senior citizens for the most part. And they were talking about, well, we can take the cut. But most of them sounded like they didn't matter to them whether they got the cut or not, because they were, from the way they talked, you know, that they didn't need it anyway. Now, the question that was not asked by either you or your guest, and that bothered me, was that are you living on Social Security alone, or are you living on some other retirement as well?
So you think the people who supported the president in yesterday's program were probably wealthy senior citizens?
Yeah, there's no question about that. At least that's what I thought when I heard him talking. The other thing I'd like to bring up is that we've already taken a position down here in Shelby County. I work for Memphis. Memphis is one of our tenants. And Shelby County Mayor has already taken a position on the president's budget back in January, and what it calls for, frankly, is a $30 billion deficit cut, similar to that which was offered by the Congressional Budget Office in their report on, redefining the deficit. And it would have taken a $30 billion deficit, which is what they recommended, as opposed to a 52, which would have got the interest rates in line. They would not have started to climb again. And what that would have proposed would have been a 25% cut in domestic spending, a 25% cut in defense spending, and a 50% increase in revenues to make up that $30 billion by closing loopholes, not some of the loopholes that we have in the tax codes. That was primarily what our county has gone on record with, and it's surprising to me that hasn't taken more action.
Okay.
But I'd like to ask your guest something. I know I've kind of spread a lot of things out here. I want to ask your guest something, and that is, you were talking about the salaries for incoming people. I'd like to hear your response to a U.S. News and World Report article that was in this week's magazine, in which they reported that the salaries of the upper echelon directors, CEOs, and so on, of these large corporations are doubling their salaries in some cases, namely Lee Iacocca, for instance, and what you think about that, and in terms of making an even greater gap between the very rich and the very poor in this country.
Well, I'm not a top executive, so I don't have to have any particular sympathy for their lifestyles. However, I must say that the CEO of a major American corporation has a tremendous responsibility. It's a very tough job. It's a demanding job. It's long hours and lots of tension. They are compensated enormously well for that, and I don't begrudge them the compensation. What I do begrudge are these increases of inordinate amounts, and I think that's what you're referring to, particularly when they're trying to hold the line on labor increases. Sometimes, you know, some of the auto companies, for example, at one point when they were trying to keep the unions, convince the unions to take lower amounts, what they did was take huge bonuses for themselves. That doesn't make any sense. I think they've got to put some of these things into perspective and not say, you know, all right, you can't get a large salary, but take raises according to a more logical progression. Also, it's the responsibility of the boards of directors of public corporations to keep an eye on these salaries. Unfortunately, the compensation committees of many corporations are composed of people who, for some reason or another, are cowed or feel obligated to the chief executive officer, and as a result, don't watch carefully the salaries of the chief executive and his top lieutenants. And so that is the direct responsibility of the independent boards of directors.
New York Times has a very small little clip here in the lower corner. It says, calls to Capitol Hill on Reagan's appeal reflect mixed views. President Reagan's budget speech last night apparently stirred thousands of citizens to call their representatives in Congress. However, a check with the offices of a dozen senators today as the Senate began debating the '86 federal budget indicated that Mr. Reagan did not receive the mandate he might have hoped for. Aides of several senators also said that the volume of calls was not as great as that generated by earlier pleas by the president, including one in '81, his first year in office. Look inside your morning newspaper and see if it has anything to say about perhaps the number of calls that your senators receive. Your paper might have done an individual story on your two senators, and maybe we can find out how many people from Missouri called their senators, or New York or Oregon, whatever the state may be. See if there's a little sidebar in your newspaper dealing with that. Hudson, Ohio, good morning. Do you have the Cleveland Plain Dealer with you today?
Yes, I do.
And anything in there dealing with the budget?
On the front page, there's a headline, Public Dials into Battle Over Budget. And it's by the PD Washington Bureau, Tom Deemer.
Give us the first paragraph, if you would, please.
First paragraph, with President Reagan's call for public pressure nudging them forward, Senate Republicans and Democrats braced yesterday for a multi-billion-dollar budget battle that could leave political casualties on both sides.
What do you think of this whole battle? Do you follow it very closely?
I've been following, and I'm personally very upset because, looking back, we raised Social Security taxes to give stability to the Social Security system, and the paper yesterday and the day before were carrying projections on stability, pushing both Social Security into the next century and Medicare into 1998. So both of those appear to be well funded with sizable surpluses, and yet Reagan wants to take it away from the old people. The defense budget keeps on going up, yet in the middle of today's paper there's an article entitled Senate Battle Fighter Plans for Air Force, in which it says that the Senate Assistant Majority Leader Ted Stevens and other Republicans want the Pentagon to buy a third jet fighter, the F-20, because they're so unhappy with the scandals over the funding of the payments on the F-16. And so on one hand, we seem to be putting more into defense and buying things that don't seem to work. And on the other hand, when we raise our taxes to give stability to Social Security, they decide to raise Social Security for even more money. I'm not anywhere near the age of receiving Social Security, but it seems like a terrible thing to be doing to the old people. The other thing that's in our papers today, there's an article, series of articles on Bitburg. There's an editorial on the deficit. There's an editorial on aid to the Contras and an editorial on Bitburg.
The editorial on the deficit, what does that say? How does your newspaper stand on that? Does it take a stand on the president's budget?
Okay, the way it stands on the president's budget, the first paragraph just states that there is an overwhelming deficit. Then it says, like statistics, however, political facts are easily misrepresented. Example, the president pretends that deficit reduction is not a bipartisan issue when it is. Another example, he pretends that the spenders, he means Democrats, are responsible for the deficit, and that he is not, although we oversaw the 1980 tax changes that distorted and capped federal revenues. Still another, he pretends that you disagree with his budget, that if you disagree with his budget priorities, then you are not interested in cutting the deficit. The facts are substantially to the contrary. Not all spenders are in Congress, and you need only recall the military budget to know that. Not
Okay.
all spenders are Democrats. Look again at the military budget.
Hudson,
Not all deficiteers are Republican either, although it suits the conservative interest to have us think so. The President's national address was not vintage.
Hudson, Ohio, thank you very much for the phone call. Let's get a comment from Leonard Sloan.
Well, you know, I think that we have a tendency to confuse politics and economics. And of course, they fuse together so closely in this matter. Naturally, you're going to have the Republicans stating one thing and the Democrats another for their own partisan political purposes. But if there is to be any bipartisan consensus, it's got to be on the basis of the economics of the country and how a deficit affects our country. It was mentioned before about our children and our grandchildren and what we're doing to them when we leave such huge deficits. We are going to make them have to pay for it because these bonds that are being issued by the federal government will have to be paid off by somebody. And so we wind up with if this continues, with hundreds of billions of dollars in annual payments in the years ahead. And that is really untenable, and I think we just got to do something about it.
There's a lead editorial in the Washington Post this morning, and it says, Mr. Reagan on the deficit. Mr. Reagan's budget speech was a sharp and effective attack on the mismanagement by that fellow in the White House, whom he never named. A question, Mr. Reagan declared, is whether the country can compel its government, quote, to end the dangerous addiction to deficit spending and finally live within its means, end of quote. Right on. The United States, he said, cannot, quote, stay on the immoral, dead-end course of deficit spending. How true. If only Mr. Reagan had been elected in 1980, things would be different. Mr. Reagan is a tiger on deficit spending, and if he were in charge, you can be assured that there would be no huge deficit to strain and distort the economy. What do you think, Leonard Sloan?
Well, it's sort of funny. Isn't the present president of the United States the man who said that by 1984 there would be no more deficit when he was elected in 1980? I guess politicians promise lots of things. We can perhaps go back to George Washington and find lots of promises that just weren't kept. And we just got to expect that as voters and just be a little bit more selective in believing what people tell us.
Monroe, Michigan, good morning. Do you have the Monroe Evening News with you?
Yes, Carl. Good morning to you and Leonard.
Good morning. What's on the front page? I assume this is yesterday's paper then.
Yes, it's in the Evening News, and I call it Gray's Follies. Needless to say, that's the family that owns it. It's mostly AP and that budget fight just beginning. Now there are 4 small pictures: defense spending, Amtrak, Social Security, which we knew would be there, and Job Corps. The defense spending is a picture of a hand pushing down on a plane, that they're going to cut it. I don't believe it. This is the rhetoric we get from Washington.
Do you think we should cut defense spending?
We should. I think what we should do is cut the folly out. We're not going where we should go because nobody is there to really say, hey, you can't do that. A good example, our paper last week, and I wanted to call and I couldn't get through, presidential libraries. From the administration was, fine, you can cut those funds way down, but Mr. Reagan says absolutely no cut in his own personal library.
The Reagan Library.
Right. So what we're saying is, you know, I got mine, to hell with you. I want to refer to the first call that you got in was right on target. but he didn't carry on far enough. I think these calls were set up by the GOP. It had to be, because the normal reaction from the man on the street, you will not get that many successive
Are you talking about yesterday's call-in program?
yesterday's calls,
Yeah.
because it went boom, 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 boom.
It did.
For the administration. I agree with them that those people, the checks were something they could throw in a drawer, but that wasn't their main income coming in.
But let me ask you, did you call either of your two senators yesterday to voice your opinion on the budget?
Can't afford. I'm on Social Security.
Okay.
I mean, I'm on Social Security, and Medicare, with the new cuts in it this year, I've had 2 surgeries recently,
Okay.
and the bills that are coming in are terrific from a year ago, because they have cut out X-rays, pathologists, everything. I mean, they just gutted it, and the man on the street doesn't understand that unless he goes through that.
Okay, Monroe, Michigan, we appreciate the phone call. For those of our viewers who didn't watch yesterday's program, Bob Rosenblatt, who's a financial writer with the LA Times, was with us, and we asked our viewers to call in and to tell us what they thought of the Reagan speech, and he took a informal poll, and of our callers, 10 supported the president on what he had to say, and 4 were against him. Do you think that the 10-4, would that be inaccurate if you projected that on to the country as a whole? Do you think that you'd have those kinds of ratios for and against the president's budget?
That's hard to tell. That's practically a 2-to-1 ratio. I would guess that the voters of this country would largely support the president. Yes. Probably there's a huge class of people in this country who do not vote, and these are the people who are probably most hurt by these cutbacks, and these are the people who probably would be opposed to it, but their voices aren't heard in the ballots, and their voices aren't heard in call-in shows. These are not people who write to their congressmen and senators, and that's unfortunate, because things might change if they were to do so.
Brookins, in today's Richmond Times-Dispatch, has this to say about the budget in his editorial cartoon. Picture of Yellowstone Park, and we see Boo Boo and Yogi, and they're picking up trash, and it says, "You know, Boo Boo, life was much easier around here before the budget cuts cost Ranger Smith his job." Brookins in the Richmond Times-Dispatch talking about the budget debate. Denver, Colorado, good morning. Do you have the Denver Post with you today?
Good morning. Yes, I do.
And anything in there dealing with the budget?
Not on the first page. No, there is an interesting editorial, however, which takes the president to task for goading the Congress. That's the title of the editorial. And it points out what some of your other callers have pointed out, that the president has responsibility as well. And it's like he's living in a dream world if he really expects that the Congress will take total responsibility for the budget.
Mm-hmm. So the president should be submitting balanced budgets to Congress, you think?
Well, if he wants to really do more than just pay lip service to the concept, yes, I believe that's true.
Having said that, what do you think of some of the cuts which are proposed? Cuts in student loans, Amtrak, and whatnot. What do you think of some of those cuts?
Well, I think he's going after a lot of unfair policies. I think that he should still try to have a tax increase for those who can afford to pay it.
So a tax increase for those making more than $50,000 a year, what?
Yes, I'd say that would be eminently fair.
And
actually, what I really wanted to talk about was Representative Dornan, who was on the program yesterday afternoon, who I consider to be a member of the Flat Earth Republicans, along with Mr. Walker and Mr. Gingrich. I just have a couple of quotes that I want to that he made, if I could repeat those. One of them is, "Grenada is the same as Nicaragua, only worse." Second one, "If you are an atheist, then you can believe in abortion." And I think that's representative of the simplistic thinking of these Republicans.
Flat Earth Republicans, you called them.
Yeah, I think so. They're the ones who believe in monolithic communism. In other words, Nicaragua is a Latin version of the Soviet Union.
Okay. Denver, Colorado, we appreciate the phone call. Phone lines are open for viewers in all areas of the country. We're discussing the budget debate currently going on in Congress. You probably have an article or an editorial. It'd be interesting to find out how your newspaper deals with the story, and if it takes an editorial policy, that'd be interesting as well. I'm going to hold this up because a little earlier in the program you talked about how much money chief executive officers make. And the back page of the New York Times business section says, "Is anyone worth $7,315 an hour?" And the front page of Business Week this week is here. This is an advertisement purchased by McGraw-Hill, obviously. But the front page of Business Week says executive pay, and it lists the man at the top. Who made the most? Are they worth it? T. Boone Pickens Jr., chairman of Mesa Petroleum. He makes $22,823,000 a year. The two gentlemen under him, Mr. David Jones of Humana, makes $18,116,000 a year. And Mr. Castro, president of Data General, makes $7,965,000 a year. In New York City, I would assume, because it's such a financial capital, that people would follow this kind of a thing very closely.
Oh yes, they do. The executive pay sweepstakes is great conversation and great writing. Every major magazine in the financial world does it, and the newspapers do it. Because, you know, we all love to see what these fellas are making. This is the one time a year that the chief executives have to go public. In the proxy statements, all this information comes out. Otherwise, we don't know about their limousines and their helicopters and their jets and their apartments and everything, all their other perks. But when the proxy statement comes out, we get a little bit of idea of how much they make. Now, but, you know, we have to be fair about this. T. Boone Pickens, the bulk of his money was made on these hostile takeover deals in which he participated. And I suppose enough has been said and written about him over the last year or so to know exactly what he's doing and how he's making his money. I suspect, I haven't read this article, it just came out in Business Week, it's probably on my desk right now, that the next two who you mentioned, a large part of their salary are from stock options and the appreciation of the stock of their companies. They probably have major stock positions, and they executed options to increase, to add to their salary and their bonus.
So business people in New York perhaps follow how much money CEOs make the way movie fans follow movie stars almost.
Absolutely.
Arlington, Virginia, just across the Potomac River from Washington. You're on the air. Go ahead, please.
Hello. The Washington Times earlier this week and the information in that article and some information I have from the Senate staff contradicts what Mr. Sloan said earlier about Amtrak. Mr. Sloan asserted that it would be a matter of paying higher fares on Amtrak, but the article quotes the director of Amtrak, Mr. Claytor, as saying that Amtrak will not survive past September. And David Stockman has said it would be clear that the railroad would go out of business, the passenger service, that is. And the staff tells me that the wording of the budget resolution contains specific instructions that Amtrak would be terminated. So this means that there would be an end to rail passenger service in the United States, and not just a matter of paying higher fares. So there's an issue here that's a little larger, too. I wonder if you don't think that this is one of those false economies, because it puts people back into their cars and congests the highways on the East Coast that we know of, and the traffic into and out of the cities, as well as putting more people into the airplanes, so that what we have here is congestion increasing in our cities. We don't have enough parking the way it is. We should have an alternative form of transportation, especially in an energy crunch.
Arlington, let me ask you a question if I can. You said the staff tells you. I take it you work closely with Congress. Is that your job?
No, it isn't. I'm just an interested citizen. I have, as a citizen, worked in transportation areas in the metropolitan area with many organizations who are interested in preserving the for example, the nation's capital.
Okay, well, hold one second if you can. I want to refer to a little column here in USA Today. And as you take a look at it, it says, railroad passengers want Amtrak spared. If Congress goes along with President Reagan's plan to end Amtrak's federal subsidy, quote, an entire mode of transportation and an integral part of our national transportation will be lost forever, end of quote. The National Association of Railroad Passengers said, it remains to Congress and the American public to stop Amtrak's senseless destruction. Reagan calls the passenger service a mobile federal money-burning machine, end of quote. And Transportation Secretary Elizabeth Dole says states and private business should support the system. Is this an example of how special interests or people who have an interest in something like Amtrak are going to fight this budget proposal?
Oh, sure. There are special interests for every element in the budget, and this is not to be pejorative and to say that a special interest is bad by any manner of the means. I mean, there are lots of very worthwhile special interests. I think before Amtrak closes, there would be such a furor that I think it's unlikely that it will finally close. Everything will be done to try to keep it going at whatever level it can be kept going.
Another small little column in the USA Today on page 5. Other fights to come dealing with the budget. Budget battles still ahead. The Senate and House must pass a basic budget package next month. How to spend each dollar, program by program, won't be decided until October. The White House wants a quick victory on a Senate budget. Amendments would be possible later. The House is waiting for the Senate, has yet to offer an alternative to President Reagan's plan. Inside of USA Today. Mission Viejo, California. Good morning. Do you have the Los Angeles Times with you there?
I have. Headline is GOP Senators balk at showdown on budget. Decline immediate vote, fearing $300 billion plan would be beaten, despite the president's plea. Also on Schultz links Viet lesson and Latin policy. Warns against new U.S. retreat from global leadership. The reason I called, Carl, is that when you asked Mr. Sloan about that 10-to-4 ratio, neither of you mentioned the fact, the demographics of your callers. The poor people that didn't vote, they don't have cable. They don't have telephones. They can't afford to call you. Don't you realize that?
Well, some of that is obvious. We weren't suggesting that the 10-to-4 was by any means a scientific sampling. I was just saying that 10...
I understand that, but he agreed with you that that would be the flavor over the entire country. Now, the people that call you could be rock stalwart Republicans, who the Gingrich type, who are geared up for this, and they have the money to call you, and they have the cable to listen to you.
Okay, what do you...
You never mentioned demographics of your callers.
Okay, you've just mentioned it. We appreciate that.
First time.
What do you think...
Never mentioned it before.
Okay, you're absolutely right. What do you think...
Thank you very...
Well, before you go, what do you think of the president's budget and what's been proposed?
Well, he's a phony. He's phony as a $3 bill. He was out here in California, he pulled the same tricks. The people are easily fooled. And he's blaming everything on the Democrats. He has no fault to find with his deficit. It's not his deficit. It's Carter's deficit. It's the Democrats' deficit. It's Kennedy's deficit. It's everybody but him. He did the same thing out here in California. But he'll weaken. He'll soften up.
Do you think he'll win in this time?
No. Why do you think Dole called the vote off? He was scared, wasn't he?
Was that just a delay, or do you think he'll win when the final vote is taken?
Well, we're waiting to see if he can talk some of these Republicans that are reluctant to vote for him, the fear that when they run, he'll go out there and campaign against them. You know, he's not as smooth, as likable as he puts on the cable or television.
Mission
He's
Viejo.
got a little bitterness in him. Don't forget that.
Okay, Mission Viejo, California. Thank you for calling that to everyone's attention. We appreciate it. One of the items that came up that certainly deals with you and your writing as a financial columnist on personal finance is that one of the callers early in the program suggested that perhaps we do need a tax increase. And I said, well, does that mean taxes on everybody over $50,000 a year? He seemed to think that would be a good idea. Is that something we're going to see looked at, a possible income tax increase for maybe those in higher income brackets?
Well, it's going to be looked at, but I don't think we're going to see a tax increase as such. As I tried to indicate before, I think we're going to see tax reform of some sort, tax simplification of some sort, that would have the effect of raising taxes for those in the upper brackets, but not a tax increase according to our present level of tax structure.
Our guest is Leonard Sloan. He's the author of this book, Book of Personal Finance, joining us today to talk about the budget battle and how it affects you personally. Next caller is from Ann Arbor, Michigan. Good morning. Do you have your morning newspaper?
Yes, we don't have a morning newspaper per se. In fact, I could almost honestly say we don't even have a newspaper in Ann Arbor, Michigan.
You don't? Not even the Ann Arbor News, huh?
It's called the Ann Arbor News, but it's not really a newspaper per se.
Is it a daily newspaper?
Yes, sir.
It's just not a very good one, you don't think?
Not a very good, is it right? In fact, Ann Arbor is now called the Union of the Soviet Socialist Republic. We now have a socialist mayor.
Oh, you do?
Mm-hmm.
I thought Burlington, Vermont was the only town with a socialist mayor.
Well, this was just elected April 2nd.
So there's two in the country now.
Two in the country. It's very interesting.
What do you think of that?
Oh, I'm not happy about it, but however, I happen to be in the other party. I once ran for the Michigan State Senate here in Michigan.
Let me ask you, is there anything in the newspaper dealing with this budget battle? And if there's not, what do you think of what you've heard so far?
Well, in C1 of the Ann Arbor News, there's from the Newsday paper, it says, Reagan again pledges no new tax increases, and that's all it says.
I see. Well, what do you think? Did you listen to the president's speech on Wednesday evening?
Yes, I agree with Ronald Reagan. I agree that something has to be done. And he's getting the heat from the budget increases, of course, from the Democrats. But as William Buckley says, that's like the mafia getting excited about street crime. They caused it all through the entitlement program. And that's what Reagan is attacking. It's got to be done.
The Tom Wicker story or column earlier seemed to suggest the president was trying to now do away with the philosophy of the New Deal. Is that what we're seeing here, you think?
Yes, and I think that's what he said. It has to be eliminated because it hasn't worked.
Okay. Ann Arbor, Michigan, thanks for the call. Any comment?
I don't think we can eliminate what the New Deal did. There are too many things that are part and parcel of our society. Can you imagine if we didn't have the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation or the Federal Savings and Loan Insurance Corporation? We had that big scandal out in Ohio recently when some of the S&Ls that were not federally insured had to be closed for a brief period of time. There's just too much that is in the underpinning of our society that came out of the New Deal days. And I think it's going to be with us for a long time.
The business page of the New York Times today has a story referring to sort of what you were talking about, scramble over thrift failures. Earlier rescue move Wade, Dateline Washington, Nathaniel Nash wrote the story, jolted by the latest collapse of a big savings and loan association. Federal regulators are considering a proposal to begin rescue efforts for ailing thrift institutions long before they need financial assistance from the depleted Federal Savings and Loan Insurance Corporation. This story refers to Beverly Hills Savings and Loan, but you referred to the one in Ohio. There has been problems with other savings and loans in banks around the country. Are we seeing a trend? Is our banking system as we know it beginning to show some cracks?
Well, I don't know about that, but there is a big difference between the Beverly Hills situation and the Ohio situation, because the Beverly Hills S&L was insured by Federal Deposit Insurance, and so all depositors in that bank, that S&L, do not have to worry about the safety of their accounts up to $100,000. That was not the case in Ohio, where they called it a state system, but in effect it was private insurance. Neither the state of Ohio nor the federal government put its full faith and credit behind those accounts in Ohio. And that's where I think the strains are. And perhaps there may be moves, there are already, to end all private insurance and to force all banks and S&Ls to be part of the federal insurance programs.
If that was to happen, doing it with private or state insurance for the money that's deposited, would that put an increased pressure or too much of a strain on the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation?
Sure, it would put a big strain on it, and they'd probably have to raise the premiums that they charge their member banks and S&Ls to get more in the way of a backup fund, a reserve for situations like this.
Talking about financial news today with Leonard Sloan, San Clemente, California. Good morning. You're on the air. Go ahead, please.
Well, good morning, by golly. After 4 days, I finally got through.
Good. We're glad you're persistent. Sometimes that's what it takes. There's a lot of people who call. We appreciate it.
Yes, I realize. Okay, a couple of comments to lead off, if I may. You know, the people in the northeast of this country seem to think that out west we're somewhat out of touch. I just heard your guest say out in Ohio. Of course, they're beyond the Hudson. We realize that. We know a little bit about geography out here also. So, give us a break, will you? How about having somebody from the Midwest and from the West Coast on your program occasionally?
Why, just yesterday...
I got that off my chest.
Just yesterday, Bob Rosenblatt, who writes for the Los Angeles Times, was our guest.
Yeah, from where?
He's from Los Angeles. Well, actually, he's originally from North Carolina, excuse me, but he did write for the LA Times in Los Angeles.
Well, we call the LA Times out here something else sometimes, too.
Okay, and I'm originally from California as well, if that makes any difference. But go ahead, what's your question?
My point is that the statement that was made by my neighbor up the street about the vote-in, call-in yesterday morning, people who did not have televisions, people who did not have telephones, there are some areas of these United States you don't get TV unless you do have a cable.
Uh-huh.
There are other areas where telephones are subsidized for those people, and my late mother was one of them out here. Then all she lived on was her Social Security. I live in San Clemente. Now, everybody would automatically think, well, gee, he has money. I don't have a lot of money, and I support the president's actions, and I think it's about time the people back there quit playing politics on our national situation, which is pretty desperate right now. Not only in the financial world, but in the world as a whole. Now, I'm a veteran of 3 wars for this country. I speak other than the English language. And I know what people think of us as Americans now. Now, that's what we elect our leaders for, and I think it's time they got on the job.
So you think Congress is being irresponsible as far as the budget's concerned?
I think so, yes.
And that goes across the board, Republicans and Democrats?
That's just across the board. The Republicans are just as guilty as the Democrats in this case, because we have an election in '86 and they're running scared. They don't know what in the world to do.
Okay. San Clemente, California, we appreciate the phone call. Leonard Sloan, does sometimes this partisan politics hurt the budget process?
Well, there's going to be partisan politics. I mean, we can't avoid it, and we can hear it just in the telephone calls we've heard this morning and during this hour. We've heard sharply contrasting viewpoints about the budget and how the windup of this whole thing should be. So that's a democracy. We've got to expect that, and the hope is that out of this melange of views, Congress will come up with some sort of a reasoned compromise that will get us back on the track in terms of economic growth.
As a financial columnist for the New York Times, what do you read to gather your information? How do you collect your sources and your information for a column?
Well, I do a tremendous amount of reading. It seems my head is always buried in reading. I read about 4 or 5 newspapers a day. I read all of the business magazines as well as some of the general news weeklies. I'm on the phone all day long talking to people, to economists, to business leaders, to some political people as well. And then I do as all reporters do. I use anecdotal evidence. I go to cocktail parties and I walk into my barber shop and I talk to people in the luncheonette and get just a little bit of what people are thinking, what some of their problems are. And I look for things, ideas in terms of their own personal economic problems, and those are the things that I tried to cover in the New York Times Book of Personal Finance. What you or I or any individual thinks about, not so much about the budget, which perhaps you and I can't do anything about, but about our own life insurance and about our own securities investments and about our own tax-saving measures and all the things that individuals can do to help themselves to a better financial future.
Novi, Michigan, you're our next caller. Do you have your morning newspaper?
No, I just take the evening paper.
Is that what's the afternoon paper there?
Detroit News.
Is it a very good newspaper?
Very good.
Very good. And how did the Detroit News deal with this budget issue yesterday?
Well, it done very good, but there's one question that is muddy in my mind. I can't understand how freezing the Social Security is going to affect the budget, because as I understand it, what is paid in goes into a fund and is paid out to Social Security recipients, so it don't go in the general fund, and it should have no effect on the budget itself. And I have two more questions I'd like to ask and then have you answer them.
Okay, go ahead. What are the other two?
And the second one is, I think the biggest cost people think is for military hardware. Well, I think the reason I was in 2 wars, I think the way around that is to go back the way we were and have a universal draft of 2 years and pull them back, drop the salary down where it was, and instead paying high salaries.
Okay, what's the third?
Minimum salary.
Caller, unfortunately, I'm running out of time. I appreciate the phone call. Thank you very much. What about his comment about Social Security?
Well, the president keeps saying that the Social Security is a separate system. It has no connection with the budget, but in effect, it really does. That when the Social Security system, if we were to run at a deficit, it would affect the overall budget, and that's just the facts of life.
Leonard Sloan has been our guest. He's the author of this book, New York Times Book of Personal Finance, and he writes a column in the New York Times. Been with them for over 20 years.